So, how about that N5 November release date, huh? Welcome to Mild Speculation, Episode 6, where, since we have time, we're going to do a profile analysis video. Now, what we're not going to be talking about in this video is basically anything Kestrel or JSA. And the reason for that is they are completely new factions, and we also have kind of very close to, but not quite yet complete pictures of what they will look like. And since that means we have enough information almost to do an entire video for each of those two factions, I would basically just rather wait until we have enough information to do a video for each of those two factions. So for example, for Kestrel, that means waiting until things like the drummer profiles are released, which is probably not going to be terribly far away. Now, that said, even though we won't be talking about almost any Kestrel or JSA profiles in this video, Corvus Belli has still dropped a lot of profile teasers, basically since the announcement was released that there would not be a November release of N5 and it would be released sometime in mid-ish December instead. This is a pretty reasonable stopgap from a hype and release train kind of deal, and I honestly expect we'll probably see basically one or more profiles more or less every day until release, because it's just a good way of keeping the community engaged when you have had to kind of unavoidably delay releasing the edition, presumably to do things like profile tune-ups and getting all of the infrastructure in place ahead of release. This means we've got a lot of profiles to talk about. I think spanning almost every faction. There's a lot there sprinkled across pretty much all factions, including there's going to be one Panosianian profile that we'll look at, but otherwise there's Aleph, there's Hakkislam, there's Nomads, there's Combined Army, etc., and we'll be covering all of them. Now, this will just be a hot takes video, and since it's a hot takes video, I just want to pause again and remind people of the parable of the Shakush, which is a bit of a conversation about how to actually evaluate N5 profiles. Now, I talked about all of this. This is people who have seen the mild speculation video about the on-tabletop N5 theme week will be familiar with this idea because I talked about it at the end of that video. But just to reiterate, the only objectively wrong way to evaluate an N5 profile is as if it was hot dropped in total isolation into N4. Now, that sounds super obvious when I say it that way. Yes, obviously, of course, it's a new edition. There will be almost every profile is going to be changing to some extent, which means the metagame will be very, very different. And despite that being really obvious to me, and I expect most people watching this video, we still see people looking at these new profiles that are being spoiled by Corvus Belli and analyzing them in the context of N4. Probably the worst and most egregious example I have seen is we will talk about Adel Mut Crane Rank armor in this video, and Adel has received quite a glow up. He's a solid profile now, probably. How people have been looking at him is they look at him and they have been comparing him to the N4 Crane Rank and saying, oh, well, he totally obsoletes the N4 Crane Rank. He's an N5 profile, and we haven't seen the N5 Crane Rank. It seems quite obvious that if Adel is getting a makeover in advance of N5, then the Crane rank will probably also receive at least similar attention. But there are still people who have looked at Adel's profile and said, oh, well, I'll never take a Crane rank now, by comparing him to the N4 Crane rank. And this is something that we all did, for example, in N4, actually the end of N3 when N4 profiles were being shown off, when the Shakush came out, and at the time it looked incredible because we were comparing it to basically all similar profiles in N3, and N3 tags were more expensive, they were less good, etc. They'd received buffs over the course of the edition, which have now become part of the game, things like tactical awareness, but the Shakush looked wildly efficient, and it fit fairly well into N3's metagame. N3 was a pretty wide and light meta. You would see generally fairly wide armies spamming troops. For example, I took a 3 combat group list to at least one tournament. And so in that environment, a heavy machine gun was kind of all that you needed, and Hakkislam benefited from having a solid heavy machine gun. But then N4 rolled around, and the Azrael got its glow up with the edition change. And more of an armor-centric meta began to emerge, and it actually became kind of difficult to spend 58 points on a model that couldn't necessarily dislodge an enemy tag on Overwatch, for example. And so the Shakush has just kind of drifted into mediocrity. It's not bad, but it's not good enough to really be taken in many lists, particularly competitively optimized lists. And so, when we are looking at these profiles, we have to just at least be aware of the fact that we don't have a picture of what N5's metagame is going to look like. We will have to be a little bit predictive, and because we are attempting to be predictive, there is going to be uncertainty. That uncertainty means I am very prepared to be very wrong about an awful lot of the takes in this video, and we're going to kind of try and moderate our positions as a result, hence mild speculation. So with that reminder that what we're going to be doing here is trying not to assess these as if they were N4 profiles, but rather maybe try and crystal ball gaze a little bit into what N5 might look like. Let's jump into a bunch of profiles and talk about them. So first up, we have the Keyo Vul Patrol. Keyo Vul Patrol is comprised of a dozer and a Keyo Vul. They are two troops, they are both regular, they both have to be part of the same combat group, and they have to be taken together. Which means that at minimum it's 21 points of spend, and more often it's going to be something more like 26, which is still pretty cheap for two troopers. Now, the dozer has nothing particularly special going on. Light shotguns and submachine guns. This is fairly cheap specialist profile, Whip 13, Engineer Deactivator. But to note, decharges are obviously useful. Engineer is a profile that can do certain classifieds and is good in certain missions, and we can on the 14-point Dozer KVP profile see the armed turret, which has made an appearance elsewhere, for example on Fireflies in Kestrel. Now, we have no idea what an armed turret is like, but there are going to be, based on the fact that this one says armed turret rifle, different types of armed turrets. We might see armed turret flamethrower, for example. This one will have a rifle, it's obviously fairly cheap. And by comparing the dozer to the Firefly has an armed turret and the mine layer skill. The dozer lacks the mine layer skill. So we can assume that armed turrets are deployable pieces of equipment, but in the dozer's case, he doesn't get to deploy it for free at the beginning of the game. He's going to have to place it at some point by spending an order. Now, in terms of turn 1 defense, that obviously makes him much less useful than the Firefly, which can just start the game, presumably, with its armed turret deployed. But I am still a big fan, at least in concept, of the idea of deployable turrets. But I do think it is probably going to be challenging to find that order to place one with the dozer much of the time. I am not expecting armed turrets to be particularly powerful. In fact, I'm expecting them to be approximately statted in line with the turrets that already exist in various scenarios over the course of ITS so far. Which is to say, moderate armor, dies when it takes a wound, relatively low ballistic skill, but hey, it's a free model that can take AROs, in this case if you just get an order down to place it. The Keyo Vul, by comparison, is a mechanical antipode, and people I think were expecting this thing to be like super badass. And it's not, but it's not expensive either, which is really interesting. So the model is okay in close combat. It has close combat 21, but with close combat attack +1 burst, which means that in terms of punching down or really just fighting anything that isn't a martial artist, it's probably fine, but I wouldn't want to run it into basically anything, particularly with martial arts too. It has both a sensor and a biometric visor, which are pretty high utility. Well, they are moderate utility items, but they're not particularly expensive. And it's got mimetism and dogged. In terms of weapons, on one option we have a trench hammer, a shock CCW, and a chain colt, and on the other we have chest mines, crazy koala, trench hammer, and shock CCW. I suspect that the chest mines profile will probably see the most play. It's only 2 points extra. And assuming that they don't change significantly, the chest mines provide kind of a more dangerous fork, and Crazy Koala is just kind of a cool piece of equipment to have for not particularly many additional points. But we were going to have to see, again, that's going to be a kind of a meta pick, and it's going to kind of depend on whether or not chest mines change. So what do I think about the dozers and the Keyo Vul? Well, I personally quite like them, but I like them in the context of their points cost, which is very low. The Keyo Vul at 10 or 12 points in particular is regular, it's not impetuous, it can claim cover, it has mimetism, it is very fast. It doesn't have smoke or anything like that, so if you want to use it as an offensive piece, it is going to have to find its own way to leave the deployment zone. but it's a very good kind of hybrid piece. It can kill things, it's good enough in close combat to be a genuine threat, particularly if it forks with the chest mines on the way in. It's got a variety of utility elements, and it's just annoying enough to kill that a bunch of the time it will be frustrating for your opponent to have to deal with, or it will do some damage. And at 12 points or 10 points, it has that most wonderful of luxuries, which is that it doesn't ever have to do anything and it's still fine, because these are both regular order pieces. Minimum investment for these two guys is 21 points. And while 21 points for two regular orders in Ariadne is expensive, because Ariadne can access some very cheap regular orders, and will probably still be able to in N5, those are still cheap enough that if neither model ever does anything, you're like, oh, I paid a small premium for the potential, and then when that potential kicks in, you get really good outputs. So I like these, I can see putting these in. If you can just find a couple of points to upgrade cheerleaders into these guys, you get a specialist and a utility piece that can kill things, and that's just cool. So I am a big fan of these. I know there are people who were let down by the fact that the keyboard Volk is not a bearpode because it's a cyber antipode. And like, fair enough, yes. But it's just a cyber antipode. We've seen the profiles for antipodes. They're not that dangerous. And this is more dangerous than an antipode. So I am a fan. I like them. Will be very interesting to see how they play. But if nothing else, you get your value out of these just with regular orders and potential. Next up, we have Hatel Alis Kissan, the first Toha profile we have seen for N5, and you'd be forgiven for thinking, has she changed? This is just Alis Kissan from N4? And yeah, kind of, she is a little bit. She lost access to a viral weapon, instead she gained access to a cheaper AP rifle and EM carbine weapon. An EM carbine has carbine stats, so rifle range bands burst 2, but on electromagnetic ammunition, that's pretty good. The only other thing she got that's particularly notable is shock immunity, which on a regeneration profile does kind of matter. Now, given that Toha are getting no new units, really the most interesting thing about Alis is that she did receive some attention, right? She's obviously been looked at by the developers. There are some small tweaks. She's very slightly cheaper. I think even the K1 Combi rifle profile is a little cheaper than it was previously, and it's gained shock immunity. So, she is obviously a little better than she was previously. But honestly expect that she will just continue to be used in the same way that she's been used for most of N4, because the classified deck, at least as far as we know, is not changing. It will translate into N5 as it is. It's a relatively modern product, and so that means the reason you take Alis Kisan is if a tournament lineup has either countermeasures or highly classified, because she's just a very solid piece for performing either of those two missions. She can cover a lot of bases by herself. She's a character, she's got decharges, she's a hacker, like etc. She can do a wide variety of classifieds, and that's pretty much what you'll keep using her for. She's now cheaper, right? She's potentially 4 points cheaper. If you previously were taking the K1 profile and trade that out for the AP rifle profile, it's 4 points cheaper than it was in N4. Cool, I can use 4 points for something like taking a war call, for example. But the overall package otherwise is not enough. Without having seen any Toha profiles for N5 really other than her, it's not enough to incentivize me to put her in and displace something else, unless a lot of other things in Toha get worse, and I don't really expect that. Next up, we have the Hassin AR, who has received, yep, a little bit of a developer workover. Now, there are, firstly, new rule that is present here. Bang Bomb. Pause for audience laughter. Bang Bomb is the only rule I have seen added to N5 that I think is just bad, dumb, and shouldn't exist. In addition to having a stupid name, which I assume sounds better in Spanish, the Bang Bomb literally doesn't need to exist. It is a piece of equipment that gives you a bonus to your dodge rolls, but does not work against template attacks. Okay, fine. You can literally replace this with dodge -3 to have approximately the same mathematical output, right? That is, when you declare a dodge, you impose a penalty on your opponent, blah, blah, blah. You could replace this with dodge -3, have basically the same mathematical outcome, and not have to add an entirely new piece of equipment to the game. I assume this is meant to be a flashbang, but it is going to be the most forgettable, least important piece of equipment since sniffers. In fact, sniffers were probably more important than the bang bomb will be. I really want to just see that go away. And if it's a change that Corvus Belli makes between now and release, where they just remove the bang bomb and give anything that had bang bomb +4, bang bomb, Jesus Christ, dodge -3, good. That would be a good change. Otherwise, we can see that a lot of the core intended shtick of the AR remains in place relative to its N4 incarnation, where it has surprise attack -6, some profiles with hidden deployment, and profiles with hollow projector. Now, I do note that some of the shell games you used to be able to play with the AR are gone because it appears to no longer have the hollow mask skill, which is still present in N5, and we'll see on a profile further in through this slideshow. But the basic idea of using either hidden deployment or hollow projector or both to combine with surprise attack and impose a fairly nasty negative modifier on your opponent is still present. It's picked up triangulated fire, which with those viral pistols we may see have some use. And probably more importantly, it's also picked up just a variety of new profiles. So, in particular, the two hidden deployment profiles now just have ballistic skill attack +1 burst, and in addition to the AP rifle, the old shock marksman rifle profile has traded that out for a thunderbolt. And that I think is probably going to be probably the most relevant change, because one of the challenges of the AR is, especially the hidden deployment model, really doesn't want to have to spend multiple orders getting into range to declare a meaningful surprise attack. And especially rifles kind of have that problem where hollow projector is not the same as camouflage, and it does allow your opponent more agency in their ability to respond. And although you can often use hollow projector to preserve your ability to declare a surprise attack, it is riskier and more difficult, and if you're trying to maneuver something from your deployment zone into rifle range bands, it can be very challenging to have that surprise attack pay off. But a Thunderbolt has HMG range bands, and a Burst 3 Thunderbolt that just appears and makes a surprise attack, armor piercing effectively damage 15, which I believe will be probability of survival 5 in N5. That can just, in a single order, its own order from hidden deployment, make a good surprise attack against an enemy ARO piece. And because Sixth Sense is both more difficult to gain access to and doesn't give bonuses to, so it doesn't give the immunity to surprise attack anymore, the number of models that will be immune to surprise attack -6 is considerably, like massively reduced compared to N4. And so the AR might actually translate into something that does what it's meant to do, which it hasn't. Basically, in any previous edition, the AR has, for as long as I've been playing Infinity, always been an absolute meme pick at best, even after a profile rework in N4. But in N5, it might actually have some legs. Now, the points costs are still high. 37 to 40 points is a lot, and given how some other pieces have changed, that slot might be more heavily contested than ever. And so I am very much assessing the AR in the context of the parable of the Shakush, because it doesn't look too bad right now, but other pieces have changed in a way that kind of shows us that that kind of more expensive HI might really be coming into their own in general this edition. And although there aren't that many pieces of that type in Hakislam and Hassin Baram, there are some, and if they receive even remotely similar glow-ups, they will be very competitive, and the AR will have to be competing for points against those. Now, that's just a possibility. And if nothing else, the fact that all of the AR profiles are 0 SWC does make including it a little easier than maybe something that is competing for SWC would. So I am very cautiously optimistic. I think the Thunderbolt profile is the most interesting of all of these five. But I would be at least prepared to experiment with any of the others, not least because one of them has the Disco Baller, which is a new piece of equipment that is, in effect, a way to generate Eclipse templates on a regular and repeatable basis. And access to Eclipse is something that could really materially change how Hackislam approaches certain matchups. So I will keep my mind open with regards to all of these profiles. If I try one, it will be the Thunderbolt one first. Overall, I have moderate expectations, but I'm prepared to be pleasantly surprised. Next up, we have our Nomad troop, the Switches Grouper. And yeah, this is a weird one. This thing makes the most sense. Now, we don't know exactly how Transmutation Whip works. We've received some rule spoilers from Corvus Belli, but there's a little bit of language nuance. Here is my take based on what Corvus Belli have said about how Transmutation Whip works. At the beginning of any order or ARO, you can attempt to transmute into the enhanced profile. You make a whip roll, and if you succeed, you occupy that new profile for the entirety of the rest of the turn. Now, That bit there is the kind of awkward bit where it's like, okay, so what does for the rest of the turn or for the turn mean? Do you transmute back? My assumption is you transmute back in the states phase. So if you use this in ARO, you transmute back in the states phase of your opponent's turn. If you use this in active, you transmute back in your states phase. Then you have to be making willpower rolls again to re-enhance. And so this means that, especially in ARO, the switches grouper has that like 1 in 3 chance of any order that it will just be using its kind of janky and bad profile. And especially if we look at the differences are considerable. The enhanced profile switcher has much, much better close combat, and it has an X visor, and it has higher fizz, and it has more armor, and it has martial arts, and it has dogged, which it doesn't in the non-enhanced profile. And it has immunity BTS. By the way, immunity BTS is just total immunity, but only against attacks that target BTS. They should still have the comms attack immunity. I think immunity BTS is going to mean that flash pulses are lethal against you, but we'll have to see. They may also have the immunity to non-lethal effect rolled in, which would be excellent if true and weird if not. But in short, this is kind of a gambler's profile, but it's not a bad gamble. You have a 2 in 3 chance, 65% chance, even in ARO, if you're getting shot immediately in ARO, of being able to translate over into the more powerful form. And the more powerful form is fairly cost effective for what you're paying. Now, you're not paying nothing, right? These are still profiles that range between 18 and 24 points. And probably the most attractive of those profiles is the 24-point +1 burst Thunderbolt. Now, this thing is only Ballistic Seal 13, but in a Link team, that's going to be effective just about Burst 4 with a weapon that is eminently serviceable. And it's quite dangerous in close combat, being able to Berserk. All of the profiles have got viral CC weapons at probability of survival 6, which is okay. And I can see that profile in particular having a place in Tunguska if you are running a list that is otherwise drawing down on a lot of SWC and is looking for just something that is a solid range weapon or solid enough range weapon at long range ban. So if you're running a list that is kind of like what we would call an N4 classic list, which spends plenty of SWC on things like hackers and guided missiles and support pieces and maybe one big SWC to gun, then having a 0 SWC weapon that you can slot in and link has, a fair bit of utility in the context of how we think about things like nomads in N4, but all of that could change. Now, it is still kind of a gambly profile, and this is still a single wound piece. 24 points for a single wound piece, even when it's Armor 3, BTS 3, Immunity BTS, and Dogged, is on the expensive side and not too hard to lose. And so, as much as the gimmick is cool, it is possible that these will just fall back into the problem of medium-esque infantry. Obviously, these are light infantry, but they're costed in a medium infantry kind of way. Maybe you just can't really afford to risk 24, 23, 19 points on a model that is single wound. Now, they have a structure rather than wounds, which means that if you're running engineering synergy in Tunguska, you have the ability to get them back up. They're not shock immune, but we also haven't seen the rules for shock ammo in N5 yet. So look, I am, again, I think cautiously kind of optimistic. I think the Thunderbolt is the most interesting profile, but depending on how either the Securitate or Spetscorps fire teams shake out, you might also find some utility in the Forward Observer AP SMG profile, just to add some good enough, cheap enough specialist close combat to a small forward-moving Haris team, perhaps as part of a list that is running as many models as possible with structure to really make a lot of use out of a good engineering piece. Overall, I think these guys are a little bit jank, and you just know that these are going to come in a blister that includes two of them, one in the regular profile, one in the enhanced profile, so they will probably be dollars expensive as well. But if nothing else, they are kind of interesting, and any +1 burst Thunderbolt I think has at least some potential playability because it's a 0 SWC weapon. Next up, for the combined army, we have Patrocles, Team Achilles Shadow. Now, you will note in the top right of the profile, it looks like he can only go in combined army generic, but there has been the Onyx Contact Force note in the combined army video, noted that they would include Team Achilles. So my expectation is that this is just Army Builder is still being updated even this late in the piece. I think that's very believable. I expect to be able to see Patrocles in Onyx Contact Force, and that's interesting. Now, how is Patrocles doing post-resurrection in N5? Well, I'm going to go on record and say I think he is jank, but I think he is the really good kind of jank, where there is just enough going on, there are just enough edge cases, there are just enough cheeky possibilities with him that I can see myself actually kind of unironically playing some of these profiles from time to time. Now, yes, it's a hollow mask. Hollow projector profile, hooray! Everyone's favorite combination. It's fine. It's fine that he has this combination. It is a good home for jank. I just kind of hope these rules get cleaned up a little bit because you will never find a more misunderstood set of rules than Hollow Mask and Hollow Projector. It was true in N3, it was true in N4. I kind of hope it isn't true in N5. Maybe they'll finally clean these rules up, but I do not expect it. On the assumption that they work the same way they did in N4, however, yep, cool, okay. He can pretend to be someone else, even if it's just a different Patroclus profile, and he has all of the usual things you expect from a Hollow Projector, the ability to put those echoes out. He has a nano screen, courage, decent stat line, CC22 is okay, 13's kind of across the board, armor 2, BTS 6. He has shock immunity and no wound incapacitation, and although he has no cover, he has the nano screen, so he has cover effectively. He also has surprise attack -3, which will work with the hollow projector, and stealth and specialist operative. So there's a grab bag of stuff there. 6-4 movement is also particularly notable, and it's as we dig through all of those different rules and then look at the profiles that we start to see where the good kind of jank emerges. So I'm going to focus in particular on the 1SWC 35-point profile. There are two others. Both of them more expensive. The FTO profile will presumably be able to link with other Team Achilles models. The multi-marksman rifle profile doesn't cost SWC and does have a medikit. But let's just focus for the moment on the HRL profile. So it has a heavy pistol, a heavy rocket launcher, a pulsar, and smoke grenades, but nothing that increases its burst or anything like that. So that heavy rocket launcher is just ballistic skill 13, just burst 2. But a heavy rocket launcher on a hollow projector model is actually kind of cool because it means you can do things like put even just one of those echoes when you deploy it with forward deployment +4. You can put one, maybe even two of those echoes in a position where, if it's real, the HRL arrow isn't tolerable for your opponent to risk. So your opponent has to look at those echoes and go, well, look, the one that's hiding behind the building, or the one that has sort of like the long oblique fire lane across your deployment zone, that's probably the real Achilles. Probably the real Achilles. And if you are a person who's willing to gamble, then you have all sorts of options in terms of like, but maybe it's not. Maybe this one that's watching your core fire team, just waiting for them to move, is the real Patroclus Team Achilles Shadow. And because it's a hollow mask in addition to hollow projector, unless you obviously have all 6 SWC accounted for, even if you take the 0 SWC 42-point profile, you can still do the same fake out because your opponent has to treat any suspicious model deployed at the 16-inch line in a position watching their deployment zone as if it was Patroclus with a heavy rocket launcher. So the kind of passive benefit that you can get from this guy is just significantly higher than things like a Hassin AR, which don't have Hollow Mask anymore and so don't conceal weapons that they're armed with. Patroclus, by comparison, instead has that really nice, like, it's easy to tell what the threat might be. You can just tell your opponent, oh yeah, Patroclus is a Hollow Mask and Hollow Projector for deployment model, and he can have access to a heavy rocket launcher. So just by default, you get that kind of interesting fake out value, and you can play games within games with that. All right, cool. Is that worth -WC and 35 points? Probably not by itself, but the rest of the profile does stuff. It has stealth and smoke grenades and good enough close combat to kill basically anything that isn't a close combat expert, and it's a specialist, and it's 6-4 movement, which means that if Patroclus needs to roll up his sleeves, he can just go and kill something. He's already forward deployment +4, he's got Hollow Echo that at some point might have reestablished itself after he's wasted some of your opponent's orders for free in reactive turn, then he can just go and kill something or press a button. Now, Whip 13 Specialist Operative is limited as far as being a specialist goes. It's very easy to fail unmodified Whip 13 rolls, but it's not nothing, right? Like, this whole profile is just full of, maybe this is just good enough. Maybe this will do something. And it's got that maybe this will do something effect along multiple different axes. It can even do things like move forward and present the hollow echoes to your opponent and be like, all right, roll your 1 and 3. And unlike something like a Hassin AR, for example, where a Hassin AR that breaks cover and tries to close the ground towards your opponent, if your opponent rolls the dice and picks correctly, then the AR is out of cover. It's going to have a bad time. But because Patroclus has a nanopulsar, a nano screen, he's even good at moving in those straight lines and being like, if you guess wrong, I am 100% taking a heavy rocket launcher shot against you for free, and you can't risk that, etc. So there is just enough here that Patrocles is, for the first time ever, a Hollow Mask, Hollow Echo profile that I am actually seriously considering putting in potentially even competitive lists. On top of that, if he goes in Onyx Contact Force, then he's Smoke in Onyx Contact Force. That'd be really nice. So in short, there's a lot here. There's like a lot more here than it looks like at first glance, and I'm quite willing to give Patrocles some time. He will probably be one of the pieces, not without having seen much else, that we're getting for Combined Army in the coming edition. I'm keen. I will give him a shot. I'll probably give him a shot in both Onyx Contact Force and Vanilla Combined Army, but I think I'm probably more interested with him in Onyx Contact Force, assuming that he can join the OCF. Next up, we have one of a couple of profiles that has been shown off for the revised Imperial service, the Wang Imperial Tag Police. This is a profile I am very interested in because it's one of my favorite types of profiles, at least in the context of N4, which is the Silhouette 6 tag that is pretty close to a Silhouette 7 tag, just on a smaller base. And I say that because this one has the very notable Armor 7, which is rare on Silhouette 6 tags, but really does make the difference. Against things like armor-piercing rounds, that Armor 7 translates into effectively Armor 4, which you would only otherwise get from an Armor 8 model. And as such allows this model to take hits almost like a full main battle tag, while being on the much more maneuverable, easy to use Silhouette 6 profile size. So just on that alone, I would be immediately interested in this profile. Now it is costed like a main battle tag. 72 points, at least in N4, would buy you a Lizard or equivalent. What are we getting for those 72 points? Well, it's Ballistic Skill 14, it's got a Biometric Visor, it's got Tactical Awareness. There's a bunch here that is just, okay, yep, tags are kind of staying pretty similar from the looks of it. I had speculated that some tags, like larger tags, might be getting the limited cover skill. Yeah, well, this thing certainly isn't, and if this thing isn't, it's pretty likely that maybe other tags are not changing hugely as well. Fair enough. It's still got tactical awareness, that's, yep, very present, cool on tags, and it has the excellent ballistic skill attack -3 skill. Now, couple of things to note about this. Firstly, it's just becoming more prevalent in Infinity N5. Okay, cool, it's a very good skill. However, it's no longer without counters. There is a new skill, Warhorse, which is just veteran being renamed, which is great, by the way, because it means that veteran troops are no longer confusingly confused with troops with veteran. Troops with Warhorse have all of the abilities that veteran had in N4 and are immune to the effects of ballistic skill attack -X. And so, for example, if the Wang is playing into Morats, which I assume will keep Warhorse, that ballistic skill attack -3 is not going to do anything because so many of the models in the faction will have immunity to its effects. But that notwithstanding, it's still a very good skill, and it combines with fairly solid profiles otherwise. We have like no real armor-piercing rounds here. We've got a heavy machine gun or a burst 4 Mark 12, and that's it. Which does mean that the Wang's ability to dislodge entrenched heavy armor is going to be limited. If we see N5 shape up as a tag meta in the same way that N4 did in some respects, this thing having to sit down and just fight its way through an enemy main battle tag is going to be a challenge. For example, one of the worst fights for a Wang is another Wang. Those two can just blast away against each other ineffectually for ages. A Wang is not going to be particularly good at dislodging an enemy Wang that is in cover and preventing the rest of your army from progressing. Despite that, these are attractive profiles. The HMG or Mark 12 are being combined with a variety of non-lethal weaponry, adhesive launchers, and riot stoppers, and particularly the ballistic skill attack +1 burst, right? If you're wondering, well, why would I take that? It is just a weaker range HMG. It's because your adhesive launcher rifle, for example, gets +1 burst as well. So if you want to make an aggressive non-lethal attack that can deal with things like enemy armor, for example, a different non-lethal way, we might see the Wang have some legs that way. The Shengdiao, probably mispronounced that terribly, ancillary remote unit is also an interesting piece. If you are wondering what periphery ancillary does, it's a deployable peripheral that once deployed can go any distance from the Wang. So it can't fight, it's just a mobile little gremlin, but it's a Whip 12 specialist operative, and being able to deploy one of those and go and do things is useful. It's apparently worth 3 points of the Long Wang's total value, and we can maybe expect to see some similar pieces like this. Crabots, for example. This is basically what I expect an N5 Crabot to look like. This will probably be very, very similar on other tags in other factions. It's just that the Long Wang is the first tag that we have seen. And so my overall assessment of the Long Wang is a pretty positive one, but it is definitely a piece that I would be inclined to just not go all in on, because we will see many other things change, and the Long Wang is a solid tag, solid, like good to solid tag by the standards of N4 tags. If N4 does, if like tags don't change particularly across editions, they remain about as good as they are now, which is to say very good, then the Long Wang will probably stay a very good tag, but plenty of other things will change around it. And it is very possible that if N5 is the addition of good heavy infantry, for example, which it may well be based on some of the profiles that we have seen, for example, the Hectari shooter in Kestrel, then it is, honestly, it is extremely possible that the Long Wang is, it's the N5 version of the Shakush, where it looks pretty solid now, and I would play it, but it might just be overtaken by events. That is just a possibility, though, on its merits, based on, yes, what we know right now, based on the context of N4. I'm kind of up on this thing. I think it is solid, and it will be interesting. Next up, we have another Imperial service and a white banner, but not vanilla Yuching model, Imperial Agent Adel Mut. And I did mention this guy before as one of those pieces that provoked some responses that led to me giving that caveat at the beginning of this episode, which is that, for the love of God, please do not compare this guy to N4 Crane rank agents, because he is not going to be competing with N4 Crane rank agents, he's going to be competing with N5 Crane rank agents, which we haven't seen yet. On his merits, this is an interesting profile. Now, 49 points and 1.5 SWC is expensive, okay? That is not cheap by any metric, including in the context of N4. But what he is a profile that has just a decent baseline, right? He's what you would get if you took an Azrael, which is a profile that I like, and downgraded the HMG into a Spitfire, and then for 10 points jammed every conceivable possible additional piece of equipment that you possibly could in and said, job's a good one. Now, the pieces of equipment that you get, there's a lot. There is a lot that is going on here. The core of the profile is Ballistic Skill 13, AP Spitfire with continuous damage. He is linkable as a wild card in Imperial Service and White Banner, which means that he will quite easily get, if nothing else, +1 burst, drop the worst in his ballistic skill attacks, which makes him not a great gunfighter, because ballistic skill 13, even at burst 5, is a little fallible, which anyone who's played an Azrael will understand. But the weapons are dangerous enough that you really only need to connect with 1 or 2 shots to potentially leave a mark on whatever it is that you hit. Now, in a complete vacuum, I would say, okay, on an Armor 4 BTS 6 2 wound heavy infantry, that's absolutely not worth 49 points, but it's worth certainly something. Like that's maybe that's a 40-point piece that I would not be uncomfortable paying for. What else are we getting for those remaining points costs? Well, we are getting Close Combat 23, a Deactivator, an X-Visor. We have Martial Arts 3, which is a really good martial arts level, because that's the level that gets you the extra dice drop the lowest or drop the worst, which is a big deal in it. Basically, that makes martial arts attack much, much more reliable. He is a very good close combatant. He randomly has number 2. He has a sensor. He's a specialist operative. He has stealth, and he's a warhorse, which means that he's immune to enemy ballistic skill attack -3. He also has both a monofilament and a para-CCW, and monofilaments in particular, well, no, actually, like I would really like monofilaments in the context of martial arts level, whatever the one, but martial arts level 4, which is a level that actually gives you 2 burst attack. I think you will still just connect with one of those attacks. Yes, you will crit relatively often. It's certainly better than it was, but monofilament really likes to force multiple saves to be reliable, and he won't always do that, but he will do that relatively often thanks to the extra chance to crit. But he also has a para CCW -6, which means he's very good in close combat either way. Finally, on top of all of that, he has a Disco Baller, which is a probably very useful piece of equipment because Eclipse is very useful. And is all of that worth 9 or 10 points on top of a profile? Yeah, it kind of is, but it is still expensive. You cannot just windmill slam this guy into every list, particularly in ISS, where Yes, absolutely. I expect Guangxi to make it into N5 in approximately the same way that they did, and he'll be very good. He'll be very good in just slamming it into a Guangxi fire team. But there's still probably going to be plenty of other stuff that is attractive, particularly in a reworked ISS. Sujans will probably make it through into N5 as good as they are. The Long Wang is pretty good. And that means that ISS has the potential to be a really extreme elite plus cheap fire team list, which is excellent, right? Like multiple Guangxi teams, plus the Sujans, plus the Longwang, plus Adol, and you might just about be able to fit all of those into a list, but I expect there to be some sacrifices. Nevertheless, he's good enough and useful enough and has enough utility that 49 points is very expensive, but you get a lot for that. He's pretty cool. I think he has a little bit less utility in White Banner, where the need for what he brings and the links that he slots into easily are a bit less available. But who knows? Maybe there's some kind of configuration of Zanshis that just was really begging for Adel Mut. I think getting him to benefit from the link team bonuses is the most important thing. And as a wildcard that won't contribute to that in a model that wants to kind of adopt that close assault, move forward kind of role, he's going to fit best into Imperial service, but that's just a guess. Next up, the third of four pieces that will be available in ISS, as well as other factions, we have Father Lucien Sforza Authorized Bounty Hunter. Finally, a relief from the power creep. Lucien Sforza absolutely is buffed relative to N4 and is still trash. Now, look, yes, there are going to be people who dispute that, and yes, there are things in his profile that are better than they were, absolutely. But he is still a 25 to 28 point piece that is not very good at winning gunfights, but needs to win gunfights. Now, he very notably has gained the immunity arm skill, which is total immunity against things that affect your armor, not your BTS. Cool, that's good. He's still an X-Visor Ballistic Skill 13 viral rifle. Cool, that's fine. But it's not good, right? Like, trying to take shots out at long range with that viral rifle is just not going to accomplish very much of the time. And at 28 points, you can't afford to spend, like, you can't afford in N4 and probably in N5, you can't afford to spend 28 points on a model that probably doesn't succeed in what it is that you needed to do. You can roll those dice on a cheaper model, right? A model that is 12 or 14 or even 16 points. If it's got a chance of high rolling really interestingly, you can roll the dice there. But at 25 and 28 points, the best thing I have like to say about him is that the adhesive launcher rifle +1 burst is a very funny weapon. And if you do play him a lot, then yeah, he's gonna have that one game in 3, one game in 4, one game in 5, where something about his kit, most likely the adhesive launcher, pays off in kind of a big way. But apart from that, like, dogged, non-shock immune, yes, he's immunity armed, so probably is to an extent shock immune. Yes, it's a hollow mask, hollow projector kind of model. But most likely in anything except maybe Dash Out Company, who have always been the faction that tended to have a few spare points left to upgrade something into something else. With the sole exception maybe of Dash Out Company, I do not see myself fielding Lucien Sforza, which means that he is not in any material way changed from Infinity N4. He was very, very bad in N4, he was very, very bad in N3, and he is probably not very, very bad in N5, but he is a dedicated meme pick. If you take him and you get use out of him, I'll not be surprised, but I do not think you will get use out of him as consistently or as effectively as you would for most other uses of that 28 points that you might conceivably spend. So, not great, but hey, nothing's changed. Next up, we have our Aleph unit, K2 Auxiliars. I have no idea what these will look like. The fact that they are K2, my brain is telling me that they will look like dogs. That's K9, Rob. I don't care. It's got a K in it. Surely it looks like a dog. No idea what this looks like. It is a structure and remote presence model, so it is robotic in some description. It's heavy infantry and hackable. This is an interesting profile. Now, it does say it can be part of Steel Phalanx, Dactyls, or Thorakides fire team in Steel Phalanx, but I do not actually think this is a model that is important because of its ability to link. This is actually a model that I think is most interesting, not necessarily solo, like you could throw it into a link if you had that link available, but its utility does not come from its link ability. The most interesting profile by far for me is the Mind Dispenser Para profile, which for only 12 points, that is in 12 points, 12 points is very cheap. for a model with a mine dispenser that fires mines that are potentially a mobility kill against anything in the entire game. Like, there is no model, except for those that are immune to its effects, that is willing to just completely ignore a paramine. Like, a tag can absolutely just tank on through a regular probability of survival 7 shock mine. But even though tags have quite high fizz, there's no tag that's like, oh, I'm just going to YOLO it through ammunition that might completely immobilize me. Like, no, nothing is willing to do that. And so what that means is that you can take a K2 Auxilia in maybe your second combat group, which is mostly just support pieces, and you have a turn where the support pieces didn't have too much to do, so you've got 1 or 2 orders spare. And 1 or 2 orders just spent maybe reloading and firing, or firing, whatever, that mine dispenser, and just laying paramines in and around the midfield is a fantastic way of taking orders that you have now and turning them into problems for your opponent in future turns. You can even use it as part of a coordinate, like an attack where you lay those mines down and then you engage an enemy ARO piece, for example. But just the ability to take resources you have right now and turn it into future inconvenience, I value that a lot. And for 12 points, it's really easy to access that. Do not ever take the Cybermines profile, only take the Paramines profile, unless Cybermines are materially different in N5, but that's fine. The Paramines profile is the one that we're interested in. Now, the Parachuters profile is a fantastic meme for 16 points. It will probably do something very annoying at some point, and 16 points is cheap enough to risk on a piece like that. It's fine. It'll probably be quite fun, and the Emirat profile is just 11 points for a very good corner guard. Those profiles are both absolutely fine, particularly as part of a link if that's what you want, but really for my money, the interesting profile, the profile that does something that otherwise really for the points cost, like it's hard to replicate that effect. That Para Mind Dispenser profile is really interesting and potentially really good. Now, we're on the home stretch now with the last 3 profiles to look at in this video, and these are all vehicles. VH, vehicle, you can see on the left side of the profile there. But there is no vehicle rule. Instead, there is the aerial rule, which covers all of the things we expected vehicles to do. So, an aerial model can never claim cover. It is never considered to be in base contact, with silhouette contact with enemy models, terrain, or objectives. That's a big deal. And it can never be prone or engaged. Also can't declare cautious movement. But it does mean that there aren't universal rules for vehicles. Instead, vehicle is a troop type, and the Firebat has the aerial rule, which means motorcycles, for example, will probably still just have the motorcycle rule. Now, in terms of overall design, basically all of the airborne vehicles are much more conservatively designed than I was worried that they might be. I actually think this is a really clean design. There's a little blurb in the rule about aerial that says, while in combat, aerial troopers stay as close to the ground as possible to avoid being an easy target. So they pop up, shoot and scoop, but it means that they, for practical purposes, with just those few exceptions about never being considered to be in silhouette contact with other models, objectives, or scenery items, which means obviously they can't take cover, hence the no cover rule just for redundancy on the Firebat's profile. They play fundamentally quite similar to how everything else plays. They move in relatively intuitive ways, although they are capable of making bursts of speed. Now, 8-2 movement is not especially fast, but when we look at this model, just do note that they have the jump 8 inches rule. That makes no sense as a rule unless it is specifically designed to combine with super jump to allow for long skill super jumps to move 8 plus 8 or 16 inches. And so what that means is how the Firebats move is 8 inches and shoot, 8 inches and shoot, or big 16-inch long skill whoosh through the air, which is really cool actually. I like that a lot. Now, obviously, 16 inches is a really long way, but there's other stuff in the game that moves as fast as that, right? Like a Sujan can move that quickly already, and it has climbing plus. Like we are not strangers to this level of mobility, even with Super Jump and Silhouette 7. Now, what is not completely clear, but I am going to work on the assumption, is that the aerial skill is an automatic non-optional skill, which means that it will probably turn off when the model goes unconscious, which means that you can probably still engineer them out of the unconscious state without having to use a gizmo kit. You can use a gizmo kit on them already. We can see gizmo kit Fizz 13, so we've got that 65% chance of recovering a Firebat if you wanted to use a gizmo kit on it. I would pretty much never try that if Gizmo Kit remains the same as it is in N4 while the Firebat is still conscious, because a 1 in 3 chance of unconsciousing your own model is terrible. But if the Firebat is down, you can either Gizmo kit it, or if Aerial works the way I think it does, you can repair it, at which point it resumes being airborne once it recovers from the unconscious state. Now, the overall firepower of these things this is where we're getting into more conservative than I expected, but I think that's probably good. This is only Ballistic Skill 12, and while it has no cover, it has Mimetism 6, which makes it, for practical purposes, this thing is about as durable as a 2-wound, Armor 0, Mimetism 3, Ballistic Skill 12 model in cover. That's not a killer gunfighter. That's not super dangerous. But for 36 points, it's got a Burst 4 submachine gun and a Burst 3 Thunderbolt, and that's usually the profile I think I would take. I don't see myself paying a bunch of points to give it a light rocket launcher and downgrade the Thunderbolt. I think the 36-point 0SWC profile is probably the way to go. And for those 36 points, you do get a lot of mobility. You get the ability to move up onto buildings very easily, take like jump up, jump down, jet propulsion, shots at models that maybe are hiding on rooftops. It's going to be pretty fearsome in that respect. If you are a person that is used to being able to hide on rooftops, if you have not learned over the course of N4 when a model is not safe against things with super jump, Firebats potentially will come as a pretty serious surprise and will be very nasty. But a lot of terrain does still allow you to, like, if your ramparts are tall enough, a prone model should still be able to hide from cross-map Firebat attacks. And if that's not the case, consider doing a little bit of work ahead of N5, sprucing up your terrain so that models can actually hide on rooftops against these things. But yeah, overall, we have a piece I think that is well realized in terms of the fantasy it's trying to present. This is a good set of rules for a slightly heavy jump jet, jump bike kind of trooper, but it's not super powerful. It is mobile, it's very mobile when it wants to be, but its gunfighting is only really so good, and at 36 points a model has to justify its points cost. So I think what we're seeing with Firebats is this is not codex creep, right? You can very easily, and in fact it probably will be a good idea to not put these in too many of your lists, because Silhouette 7 is really hard to hide, and if this thing can't hide, it's dead, because if any kind of gun tees up on this, even Mimetism 6, if any kind of gun tees up on this in their active turn, the Firebat will go down super fast, because 2 structure and 3 armor with no cover is not durable, like, at all. But against certain kind of defenses, and like it's opportunistic. It's a very good model for being opportunistic, because if your opponent has a bunch of just kind of like generic nanopulsar or chain rifle defense pieces as their only real deployment zone defense, then a Firebat can absolutely punish that. If your opponent is hanging out prone on rooftops and the rooftops really are not safe places to be when there's a vehicle around, the Firebat can absolutely punish that. It's got solid range bands, it can fight at HMG range bands, it can fight up close, it doesn't really want to fight inside that 16-inch band, but that's fine. And the ability, either late or early in the game, to just spend one order and go whoosh 16 inches in a direction of your choosing using the long scale super jump effect, all of that is solid. I think these things are just, they are conservative. They are fine, they will be solid. People will occasionally be badly surprised by how a Silhouette 7 super jump model can move, but we will all adapt to that pretty quickly. And after that, I feel like it's a 0SWC gunfighting piece. It will be okay, but absolutely just moderate your expectations about how much this thing can win gunfights and how much damage it can do, because Ballistic Skill 12 Mim 6 no cover is very mid as far as ability to win gunfights goes. Next up, and in a very similar vein, we have I'm going to mispronounce this, Fuiquan Imperial Tactical Wing. Another vehicle, it can go in Vanilla Yuching, Invincible Army, and White Banner. ISS and White Banner, not Invincible Army, and it is in many respects very, very similar to everything that we can see on the Firebat. Notably, it's got access to dodge -3, which is kind of nice. Doesn't dodge particularly well, but dodge -3 is good. And sensor is another one of those rules that's just kind of cool to have access to, particularly on a piece that's as fast as this. 8-2 with sensor is very good at making use of sensor, for example. Now, the weapon loadout here is interesting and kind of weird. We have a functionally non-lethal profile, where it's got a +2 burst, so that would be a burst 4 EM carbine, and a flash pulse and an acrylac cannon. No ability, like this thing literally cannot ever kill an enemy model because it can't perform a coup de grace, and it has no non-lethal weapons. Theoretically, you might be able to kill an immunity BTS model, maybe if the rules line up just right. In practice, this thing can't hurt you, but It is 28 points, it has 2 wounds, it's got that mimetism -6, and it has a burst 4 electromagnetic weapon. That's Look, it's niche. It's very niche. It's probably a bit weird, but it is interesting. Alternatively, if we're willing to pay quite a lot more points, we can get access to an X-Visor, Burst 4 multi-rifle, and +1 burst adhesive launcher rifle. This is probably the profile, half an SWC is not nothing, you should be able to find that. This is probably the profile you do have to take most of the time. Unlike the Firebat, it doesn't have any bonus to its damage. That multi-rifle is just going to be probability of survival 7, damage 13. But the adhesive launcher rifle is an interesting piece if you wanted to be doing that like mobility kill kind of play. And the theme here is very cool with all of those different weapons. Ultimately, a lot of what I said about the Firebat still applies to the Faikwan, but I do think that the multi-rifle +1 burst, it is the kind of piece that is going to be good at taking advantage of those 16-inch range bands. Whereas the Firebat has a nice mix of range bands and can take long-range attacks if it wants to, or short-range attacks if it wants to. The Faikwan is a dedicated kind of hunter in the midfield, where that rifle range band really pays off. And even penetration into the enemy deployment zone, that rifle range band is kind of a nice one to have. So it's more focused in how it wants to attack. It wants to be more of a predator piece, maybe like really coming around corners and having those firefights where, hey, no one has cover, so I'm not really disadvantaged here. It's pretty solid in that kind of role. And so if you are able to suppress both enemy hacking defenses and enemy long-range AROs, I can see a piece like this at 35 points kind of functioning as a we couldn't afford the Sujan or the Sujan is elsewhere, but we can have something that can really punish a null deployment. I think it can work probably even better than the Firebat can at that, and that's interesting and solid. 35 points is expensive, right, for what you are getting. You are getting a piece that needs to be enabled by other elements, but both of those sectorals and vanilla Yuching should be able to afford that kind of piece, probably more easily than the Firebat can be afforded by the sectorals that it joins. Now, very last, the one Pan-Oceanian piece that I did want to cover, just because we're talking about vehicles, is the Redeye Close Air Support Squad. Now, compared to the other vehicles that we have seen, the Redeye is much more expensive but significantly upgunned. For 1.5 SWC, which is a lot in Pan-Oceania, and 44 or 45 points, we are getting more ballistic skill than either of those models, much more armor than either of the two vehicles. Armor 6 actually is relatively survivable with no cover. All of the same speed, higher fizz, in particular fizz 14 when using gizmo kits on it, which begins to edge into reliable, but it also has remote presence, which means that if it crashes and you can engineer it while it's crashed, it's pretty easy to recover that way. And then we just have a Spitfire. We have a Spitfire and a chain rifle, and then either a Blitzen or a grenade launcher. I would be leaning toward the grenade launcher, I think, most of the time. Just because that's the kind of, for only one more point than a Blitzen, a grenade launcher is one of those pieces that just gives you a chip and a chair in various different like game states. Sometimes there's a problem that can only be solved by a grenade launcher, and so having it on the Redeye is nice. But yeah, what we are getting here is a better gunfighter that is more durable and has a full-on just a Spitfire. It's just burst 4, damage 14, but it costs you 1.5 SWC. And that cost plus the 44 points really does make the Redeye one of the most difficult of the three to assess, because you really cannot afford to just spend 44 points on a trooper and not have it always do something or always be able to survive. And in terms of immediate and direct competition, the 45-point Redeye, you could pay 3 more points and no more SWC and get access to a Hetkari shooter. And a Hetkari shooter, which we haven't covered, is the new heavy infantry available to Kestrel and presumably Vanilla Pan-Oceania, and it goes real hard. That is a model that does kind of look like power creep into N5, and is one of the pieces that is making me wonder if N5 will be the addition of elite heavy infantry, because the Hetkari shooter is a just heavy infantry with armor 5, BTS 6, and marksmanship, and ballistic skill attack -3, and ballistic skill 14, and a multi-red fury. Like, hot, hot actual damn. And that's only 3 points more than a Redeye. Now, there's no rule saying that you can't have both, but the SWC is limited in Pan-Oceania, and if you have both of them, that's 3 of your 6 SWC spent, and you don't have a non-Spitfire rangeband weapon at that point. And while, yes, Panoceania is getting access to Gizmo kits, so not Gizmo kits, to disco balls, which do enable a little bit of map crossing, access to Eclipse, etc., maybe you can play a Panoceania list that can rely a little bit more on closing to within Spitfire range bands. I do not overall expect Panoceania's faction identity to change so much that it doesn't want to establish firepower dominance at long ranges and medium intermediate ranges before it moves into close the game. And so, as much as I think the Redeye is very cool, and objectively, right, objectively it is kind of the most powerful of the vehicles, it's also the most expensive. And that 45 points cost is edging it up into levels where you just cannot justify it not doing something, so it has to do something every game. And I'm not totally sure it's a profile that will always do something every game. But that said, Armor 6 is excellent, 2 structure is good, ballistic skill 13, mimetism -6, right? It's got more ballistic skill, much more armor. It is well kitted out. And Lord knows Panoceania can absolutely make use of a piece that crosses so much distance so quickly and then begins to kill enemies in a deployment zone. So I'm not saying the Redeye is bad. I'm saying be very wary before assessing it as the best vehicle because that points cost is really significant. But there could potentially be some very cool lists that combine it with tactical armored gears and maybe just a few elements that can help suppress enemy hacking AROs, plus a good engineering presence, and you have a good force mix there. It's got potential, but 45 points is pretty eye-watering. It's going to need to justify those points costs basically every game, and a Silhouette 7 model is sometimes not going to do that. Anyway, that wraps up this video. That's all I have to say. That's an hour of content. Hope you enjoyed that. Obviously, we didn't cover basically any of the other Kestrel profiles or any of the JSA profiles, but it's very possible we'll get to those as a future video at some point between now and the release of N5. Do let me know in the comments if that's something that you'd like to see. Otherwise, in terms of future videos, I am working on a little bit of hobby content, just talking about how I come up with color schemes for armies and the development process of that, for want of a better word. That's something I just kind of felt about talking about and might take the opportunity to do between now and N5's release. We might also do, I guess I'd call it a faction farewell video. There are a couple of factions that are worth covering again between now and N5, but those really would just be a faction retrospective kind of video. Not a lot of value once we hit mid-December and N5 actually releases. So we'll see. Any of those is possible, but I do hope after a small hiatus between we missed last week's video for reasons that have been discussed in my community section. I do hope to be back on regular schedule, and that means a video this weekend and a video next weekend, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, as always, I hope very much that you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.